San Francisco, 1969. The training hall was completely dark. Not dim, not shadowed. Dark. The specific, total darkness of a room where every window has been covered, every light extinguished, where you cannot see your hand in front of your face, and the darkness has weight and texture and fills your lungs when you breathe. 12 people were in that room. 5 of them were black belts. Combined, they carried 63 years of martial arts training between them. They could see nothing. They were spaced around the perimeter of the room according to an arrangement that had been agreed upon before the lights went out. They knew where the others were because they had watched them position themselves. They knew where the center of the room was. They knew what they had been asked to do. They did not know what was about to happen to them. One other person stood in the center of that room. He was blindfolded, not because the darkness wasn't enough, because the darkness wasn't the point. The story of that evening begins 3 weeks earlier in an argument. Not a hostile argument, the productive kind, the kind that happens between people who respect each other enough to push hard against each other's ideas. Bruce Lee and James Lee, no relation, a close friend and training partner, were in Bruce's home gym in Los Angeles, and they were disagreeing about something that had been building between them for months. The argument was about sight. Specifically, about how much of what a martial artist does depends on sight, and what remains when sight is removed. James Lee's position was practical and reasonable. Sight is the primary sensory input for combat. Remove it and you remove the foundation. A practitioner without sight is operating at a catastrophic disadvantage that no amount of training can fully compensate for. Bruce Lee's position was more radical, and he had been arriving at it gradually through a line of thinking that stretched back through his training with Yip Man, through his development of Jeet Kune Do, through the early experiments with attention training that would eventually lead him to a Guangzhou courtyard and a Tokyo dojo. His position was this: sight is a crutch, not a tool, a crutch, something that capable practitioners had come to rely on so completely that their other sensory systems, the ones that operated at levels below conscious visual processing, had been allowed to atrophy into uselessness. A practitioner who trained exclusively in sighted conditions was developing only a fraction of what the full human sensory system was capable of. And then he said the thing that started the argument properly. "I think I can do it blindfolded." James Lee said, "Do what blindfolded?" "Fight multiple opponents in the dark, using sound and air movement and floor vibration to build a complete enough picture of the space that I can operate effectively in it." James Lee looked at him for a long moment. "Bruce," he said carefully, "that is insane." "Yes," Bruce Lee said. "Let's find out." 3 weeks of preparation. Not 3 weeks of blindfolded sparring, though that was part of it. 3 weeks of a complete restructuring of how Bruce Lee's training engaged with the sensory world. He began with sound. He trained in his home gym with the lights on but his eyes closed, having James Lee move around the perimeter of the room while Bruce tracked him, not guessing, tracking, building an auditory map of the space in real time based on footfall, displaced air, the subtle directional information that sound carries when you are paying the right kind of attention. He was bad at it initially. He was honest about this. His auditory tracking was imprecise. He could locate James Lee within a quadrant of the room, but not within the precise three-dimensional position that meaningful action requires. He kept going. He developed what he later described to Dan Inosanto as layered listening, the practice of receiving multiple streams of auditory information simultaneously and integrating them into a single coherent spatial picture, not listening for one sound and locating it, listening for the entire acoustic environment and reading it the way a musician reads a score, all voices simultaneously, each in its correct relationship to all others. He trained with air. He had always been sensitive to air displacement. It was part of the speed training that allowed him to slip punches at ranges where other practitioners were already reacting too late. But air sensitivity as an active sensory system, rather than a passive defensive one, required different training. He had James Lee move toward him from behind, slowly at first, and practiced feeling the displacement of air on the back of his neck and arms before the movement produced sound. He trained himself to detect the pressure differential that moving mass creates in still air, the specific quality of disturbance that a human body moving at various speeds produces at various distances. He trained with the floor. Vibration. A body moving across a floor produces vibration that travels through the structure and is detectable through the soles of the feet at distances greater than most people would expect. He trained barefoot. He trained to read weight transfer, to feel through the floor the same weight shift reading he performed visually, detecting through vibration the moments when a body's weight moved from one foot to another as a precursor to directional movement. 3 weeks. At the end of 3 weeks, he told James Lee to arrange the test. James Lee made 4 calls. The 5 black belts he selected were not chosen randomly and were not chosen to be easy. He chose them with the specific intention of making the test as rigorous as possible, because a test that is not rigorous is not a test. It is a performance, and performances prove nothing.
The first was a karate instructor from the Bay Area, 7th Dan, 22 years of competitive experience, a man who had fought in over 200 tournament bouts and won the majority of them. He was fast and he was precise and he moved quietly. The second was a judo practitioner, 6th Dan, a man whose specialty was the transition from standing to ground, who had developed the ability to close distance and initiate a throw with a speed and efficiency that his size made seem impossible. He was large. He did not move quietly, but he moved with deceptive speed given his size. The third and fourth were a matched pair in some sense, two kung fu practitioners from different lineages who had trained together for years and had developed an instinct for coordinated attack that made them more dangerous together than separately. They could split an opponent's attention. They were experienced at using each other. The fifth was the one James Lee was most uncertain about including. He was a Korean Hapkido master, 40 years old, a practitioner whose discipline was specifically built around responding to attacks rather than initiating them, whose sensitivity to incoming force was the most developed of any practitioner James Lee had trained with. He was less dangerous as an attacker than the others. He was more dangerous as a responder, because he could feel the nature of an incoming strike and redirect it in ways that turned the attacker's force against them. 5 black belts, 63 years between them, and Bruce Lee in the center of a dark room, wearing a blindfold. James Lee had one rule: no strikes to the head. Everything else was available. He stated this rule clearly to all 6 people before the lights went out. Then he turned the lights out.
The darkness was total. For the first 45 seconds, nobody moved. This was not agreed upon. It happened because darkness, genuine, total darkness, produces an involuntary recalibration in every human being who enters it. The visual system, suddenly deprived of input, begins making demands on the other systems in a way that takes a moment to resolve. The brain is reorganizing its sensory hierarchy, reassigning processing capacity from vision to the systems that are still producing data. 12 people in a dark room for 45 seconds. The only sounds were breathing. Bruce Lee stood in the center of the room with the blindfold over his eyes and began listening. Not for movement, not yet. None of the 5 had moved. He was listening to the room itself, building the acoustic map that 3 weeks of training had taught him to build. The sound of 12 people breathing told him 12 things simultaneously: approximate positions, approximate sizes based on respiratory volume, approximate states of tension or relaxation based on breathing rate and pattern. He was reading the breathing the way he read weight, at the root, before it became movement, in the place where intention lives before it chooses a direction. 4 of the 5 were tense. Their breathing was controlled but elevated, the specific respiratory pattern of experienced practitioners managing pre-engagement adrenaline. Professionals who had done this before and were applying discipline to the preparation. One of them, the 5th, the Hapkido master, was not tense at all. His breathing was the slow, deep, unhurried respiration of a man waiting in a comfortable chair. That one, Bruce Lee decided immediately, required the most attention. The first to move was the judo practitioner. He came from the left wall. Bruce could feel the vibration of his approach from the floor before the sound of it reached his ears, the floor giving up the weight shift 3 steps before the movement became audible. Large body, significant mass, moving with controlled speed toward the center of the room. 2 seconds between the first floor vibration and arrival. In 2 seconds, Bruce Lee did the following. He rotated 45 degrees to his left, not to face the approach, to angle off it, to take himself out of the direct line of a body that intended to close and clinch. He dropped his level slightly. He brought his lead hand up, not as a guard, but as an antenna, feeling the air ahead of him for the pressure differential that would tell him exactly where the body was in the final step before contact. The judo practitioner's arm came forward in the dark, reaching for the clinch position, and found nothing. Bruce Lee was 18 inches to his left. In that 18-inch gap, Lee's right elbow moved. Short arc, dense contact, the judo practitioner's shoulder. Not a disabling strike, a location strike, sending information to the body that it had been found, that the geometry of the space had been read correctly, that presence in the dark did not equal invisibility. The judo practitioner stumbled 1 step. In the dark room, 7 observers heard this and understood what it meant. 3 seconds. The two kung fu practitioners moved together. This was the moment Bruce Lee had been most concerned about in the 3 weeks of preparation, not because coordinated attack was impossible to handle in sighted conditions, but because coordinated attack in darkness presents a specific problem for auditory tracking. Two bodies moving simultaneously produce overlapping sound signatures that are difficult to separate into distinct spatial positions. The acoustic picture becomes confused, and confusion in a dark room with two experienced practitioners moving toward you is the enemy of everything. He heard them both, left and right, angling to split his attention in the diagonal approach he had heard James Lee describe. They had apparently been briefed on their own capabilities. He chose not to handle them as two problems. He handled them as one. He moved, not backward, forward, between them, splitting the approach at the hinge, taking the position that made the diagonal attack collapse because he was no longer at the vertex of the angle they were creating. He felt the first one's arm as he passed, the brush of displaced air against his left forearm, closer than he wanted, a quarter second closer than the acoustic map had indicated. He adjusted the map. His left forearm directed the incoming arm downward, not a block, a guide, the same motion as the floor that angles the river, and his right hand found the practitioner's shoulder in the dark and pressed, directional force, sending the body where its own momentum was already partially going. A stumble, the sound of it in the dark room. He was already past, already turning, already building the new acoustic picture from his new position. The second kung fu practitioner was behind him now. He felt the air. He dropped. The strike, a roundhouse kick, he identified it from the air displacement pattern, from the specific directional quality of the disturbance, passed over his head in the dark by what he estimated was 6 inches. He came back up. He was inside the kick's recovery position. He placed his hand against the practitioner's chest, flat palm, light pressure, contact registered, position confirmed. He stepped back into the center of the room. 2 down, or rather 2 managed. Neither was finished. Both were recalibrating somewhere in the dark around him. 3, 4, and 5 were still unengaged. He listened.
The karate instructor came next. He was the fastest of the 5. Bruce had registered this in the breathing patterns during the opening 45 seconds, reading the respiratory efficiency that fast-twitch practitioners develop. Fast practitioners move quietly because their speed minimizes the duration of each footfall. They are the hardest to track on the floor. He came from the right wall. Bruce almost missed him. Almost. 3 weeks of floor training meant almost was not entirely. He caught the vibration at 2 steps, less warning than the judo practitioner had given, not enough to fully reposition. He did not fully reposition. He did something more precise. He moved 1 step forward, toward the approach rather than away from it, the Jeet Kune Do principle in the dark as in the light. Do not retreat from where the attack is going. Be in the space where the attack is not going. 1 step forward changed the geometry of the karate instructor's approach by making the distance he had calculated incorrect. The instructor's timing was built on a target at a specific range. The target was not at that range. The strike, a Gyakuzuki, a reverse punch, Bruce identified it from the shoulder rotation he felt in the air displacement in the final instant, arrived in the space where Bruce had been. He felt the practitioner's extended arm against his own forearm. He followed the arm, to the shoulder, to the neck. 1 hand on the neck, light, present, demonstrating access. He released. The karate instructor stood in the dark and said nothing, but his breathing changed. The controlled professional breathing shifted into something more honest, the respiratory pattern of a man who has just processed something his framework did not predict. 4 remained. Or rather, 4 were still somewhere in the dark around him,
and 2 had already been engaged once and were somewhere in the process of deciding what the engagement had told them. And somewhere in the dark room, breathing slowly and deeply with the respiration of a man in a comfortable chair, the Hapkido master had not yet moved. Bruce Lee stood in the center of the room and listened. The acoustic picture was more complex now. 6 people breathing, his own breath, the 5 practitioners, and 4 of the 5 had been physically engaged, and their breathing had changed as a result. The room's sound signature had been altered by the movements of the previous 90 seconds. New information in the acoustic map, but also new noise. He filtered. This was the skill that 3 weeks of layered listening training had built, not the ability to hear more, but the ability to select, to identify the relevant frequencies from the full acoustic environment and extract the spatial information they carried without being swamped by everything else. He found the Hapkido master, still against the far wall, still breathing slowly, still not tense. He was waiting, not passively. The Hapkido discipline is built on the intelligence of waiting, on the understanding that a response to incoming force is more efficient than an initiated attack, that the person who moves first gives away information that the person who waits can use. He was waiting for Bruce Lee to come to him. He understood, Bruce Lee realized, what most of the others hadn't, that in this dark room, the initiative was not an advantage. The initiative revealed position, revealed sound and vibration and air displacement, revealed the approach that could be read and answered. The Hapkido master intended to let Bruce Lee reveal himself and then respond to what he revealed. It was a sophisticated strategy. It was also, Bruce Lee understood in the dark, the exact same strategy he himself was using. 2 readers, in the dark, each waiting for the other to produce something to read. 60 seconds of silence. The 8 observers held their breath. In the dark, 2 practitioners sat in a mutual listening that neither of them moved to break. The silence lasted 63 seconds. Bruce Lee later said it was the longest 63 seconds of his life. Then he did something that nobody in the room and nobody he told about it afterward had predicted. He spoke. "You're good," he said, into the dark, not loudly, conversationally. The Hapkido master across the room said nothing, but his breathing changed. 1 beat, involuntary, the automatic disruption of a controlled respiratory pattern by an unexpected stimulus. 1 beat was enough. Bruce Lee moved.
1 beat of disrupted breathing. That was all he needed. In that single involuntary breath, the half-second when the Hapkido master's respiratory control broke because his auditory system had received an unexpected input and diverted processing resources to handle it, his position became readable. The acoustic map updated. The location clarified from a general quadrant to a specific point. Bruce Lee was already moving when the breath finished disrupting. Not at full speed, not the speed that cameras couldn't catch, something more measured, the speed of a man moving through total darkness, where overconfidence in any auditory map, however carefully built, could walk him into a wall or a body at the wrong moment. He moved at the speed that the available information supported, no faster. 3 steps. The floor vibration of his own approach giving the Hapkido master the same information Bruce had been reading from the others all evening. He knew this. He had factored it. The Hapkido master responded. He came off the wall, felt it through the floor before he heard it, moving not toward Bruce's approach, but sideways, creating lateral distance, refusing to be where the approach expected him to be. Smart, correct. Exactly what a practitioner of his discipline should do. But he was moving now. Moving produced sound, produced vibration, produced air displacement. Moving dissolved the strategic advantage of stillness and replaced it with the tactical reality of 2 bodies in motion in a dark room, reading each other in real time. Now,
They were equal. Almost. What followed lasted 40 seconds. 40 seconds in a dark room between Bruce Lee and the Hapkido master who had spent 40 years developing the most sophisticated response sensitivity of any practitioner in that building. The 7 observers heard it more than they saw it. They heard footfalls, precise, quick, directional. They heard the specific sounds of bodies in close proximity, displaced air, the whisper of clothing moving fast, the particular acoustic signature of hands making contact and releasing. They heard once the sound of a stumble, brief, quickly corrected. Later, when the lights came back on, they would disagree whose stumble it was. 3 of them believed it was the Hapkido master. 2 believed it was Bruce Lee. 2 said they couldn't tell. The 7 observers never reached consensus on this point. Bruce pressed. This was the decision he made in the first 5 seconds of the 40. Not to wait, not to maintain the mutual listening that had characterized the 63-second silence, but to be the initiator, to accept the tactical disadvantage of revealing himself through movement and offset it with the quality of what his movement produced. He moved in an arc, not a straight approach, a curve, the geometry of which was designed to keep the Hapkido master recalculating his position. A straight approach is the easiest thing to read and respond to. A curved approach changes the angle of arrival continuously, making the responding geometry a moving target. He felt the Hapkido master tracking him, could feel it, not literally, not with any single sensory system, but in the integrated reading of the full acoustic environment. The floor was telling him where the other man's weight was shifting. The air was telling him what direction those shifts were organizing toward. He was being tracked, accurately. He changed direction. Mid-arc, without the preparatory weight shift that usually precedes a direction change, the direction change that costs no weight shift telegraph, that begins and ends in the same foot position, that gives the tracker a clean signal of intention and then withdraws it before the intention completes. The Hapkido master's response was already in motion for the previous direction. Half a second of his response committed to a position Bruce was no longer arriving at. Half a second. In that half second, Bruce Lee was inside his guard. He felt the master's arms, the specific position of both forearms, the distribution of weight between his feet, the slight forward lean that indicated where his center of mass was in this instant. He read it all in the fraction of second of contact, the information dense and immediate, the dark room's disadvantage briefly dissolved by the simple fact of proximity. His right hand found the master's sternum, palm heel, 6 inches of travel, the same strike he had delivered in Los Angeles in 1967, in the light, to a man who could see it coming and still couldn't prevent it. In the dark, it landed with the same precision. The Hapkido master took 1 step backward. Then he stopped. He stood in the dark, his breathing finally audible as something other than controlled meditation, something honest and real and recalibrated. Bruce Lee stepped back to the center of the room. The lights came on. Not gradually, all at once. Someone threw the main switch, and the training hall flooded with fluorescent light that felt, after the sustained darkness, like a physical force. 12 people blinked. The 7 observers along the walls stood where they had been standing in the dark, their eyes adjusting, looking toward the center of the room. Bruce Lee stood at the center of the room. He was breathing, honestly, genuinely, the deep breath of a man who has been working at maximum concentration for several minutes. His training clothes showed the physical evidence of the session, a slight dishevelment, a faint mark on his left forearm where the kung fu practitioner's strike had connected closer than he wanted. The 5 black belts were distributed around the room. None of them were where they had started. The judo practitioner stood near the north wall, one hand on his shoulder, the shoulder that had received the elbow strike in the first engagement. The two kung fu practitioners were near the east wall, standing close together, their coordinated partnership having been split and then outflanked in the dark. They looked at each other and then at Bruce Lee with the specific expression of practitioners who trained together because they understood each other and had just encountered something that neither of their mutual understandings had equipped them for. The karate instructor was near the south wall. He was completely still. His expression was the blankest of the five, the specific blankness of a man processing something that is taking longer than expected to find its correct file. The Hapkido master was near the west wall. He stood upright, hands at his sides. His breathing had returned to the slow, deep rhythm of the pre-session calm. His face carried an expression that was different from the others, not the blankness of processing, not the recalibration of surprise, but something closer to the careful, considered look of a man who has received a piece of information he already suspected was true, and now is deciding what to do with the confirmation. He looked at Bruce Lee across the room. He nodded once. One nod. The complete communication of one practitioner acknowledging another's level without the inadequacy of language. Bruce Lee returned the nod.
Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. This was noted by all 7 observers independently, each in the accounts they gave over the years. The silence after the lights came on was longer than expected, longer than the silence that typically follows a training session or a demonstration, longer than the recalibration pause that most physical encounters produce in their aftermath. It was the silence of 12 people in a room where something had happened that needed more than a minute to become a thing that language could approach. James Lee broke it. He stepped away from the wall where he had been standing and walked to the center of the room and looked at Bruce Lee. "You stumbled," he said, "on the Hapkido exchange." "Yes," Bruce Lee said. "You were red." For about a half second, Bruce Lee said. He read the arc change. He was tracking the floor vibration, and he felt the arc change. He paused. He's the best listener in the room. The Hapkido master across the room said nothing, but the careful look on his face became, briefly, something warmer. "Could you have been stopped?" James Lee asked. Bruce Lee considered this with the honesty that had always characterized his self-assessment. In a real situation, with 5 people who were actually trying to hurt me rather than engage me, yes, the darkness reduces my effective capability by perhaps 40%. I was operating at 60% of what I can do in sighted conditions. 5 determined practitioners at 60% is survivable, barely. He looked around the room at the 5 black belts. But they were also operating at reduced capability. Darkness reduces everyone. What I trained was to reduce less than they did, not to eliminate the disadvantage, to minimize it more effectively than they could minimize theirs. The karate instructor near the south wall spoke for the first time. You spoke," he said, "at the end, before you moved on Sensei Park." He used the Hapkido master's name. "You said something." "Yes," Bruce Lee said. "Why?" "Because Sensei Park was not going to move," Bruce Lee said. He had correctly identified that stillness was the strongest strategic position in a dark room. Neither of us could afford to initiate. The 63 seconds was a genuine standoff. I couldn't reach him without revealing my position. He wouldn't reveal his position by moving. In sighted conditions, I could have broken that standoff with a feint. In the dark, a physical feint is too risky. It requires commitment that reveals real position. So I used the only tool available. "Sound," the karate instructor said. "Speech," Bruce Lee corrected, specifically designed to produce an involuntary response, not the content of the words, the unexpectedness of them. In a dark room during a physical engagement, a calm conversational voice is the last thing the nervous system expects. It disrupts the acoustic tracking pattern because it doesn't fit any of the sound categories the tracking system has been organized around.
For half a second, his listening reorganized itself to process speech. In that half second, his respiratory control broke. I had his position. The room was quiet. The Hapkido master, Sensei Park, walked across the room toward Bruce Lee. He moved with the same slow, unhurried quality his breathing had carried all evening. He stopped in front of Bruce Lee and looked at him with the careful, considered look. "Using speech as a sensory disruption in dark room combat," he said. His English was precise and accented. "I have read about this principle in very old texts. I have never seen it applied. It only works once on a practitioner of your level. The next time you would expect it." "Yes," Park said, "but knowing you are capable of it would change everything else as well." He paused. "You have thought about this more deeply than the training session suggests." "I've been thinking about the relationship between sensory systems and combat for a long time. Tonight was the first time I've tested it at this level." "And what did the test tell you?" Bruce Lee looked at the blindfold in his hand. He had removed it when the lights came on and had been holding it since. "That I was right about the crutch," he said. "That sight is the most available and most processed sensory system, which means it is the one most people train to depend on, to the point where removing it feels catastrophic. But the other senses, auditory, tactile, vestibular, they contain information that sight doesn't. The floor told me things that my eyes wouldn't have. The air told me things that my eyes couldn't have. In some ways, the dark room was more information-rich than a lit one, because I was finally using the full system rather than the partial one." They talked for 2 hours. All 12 of them, the 5 black belts, Bruce Lee, James Lee, and the 7 observers who peeled away from the walls as the conversation drew them in. They sat on the training hall floor, some on benches, some cross-legged, in the informal arrangement of people who had shared something and needed to process it together. The Hapkido master spoke the most after Bruce Lee. He brought a framework from his own discipline, the concept of musim, the listening sensitivity that Hapkido practitioners develop, the ability to feel incoming force through contact and redirect it. He talked about how the discipline had developed because its founder understood that the person who is always second, always responding rather than initiating, is operating from an information advantage. The initiator commits first. Commitment produces information. The responder reads the information. "What you did tonight," Bruce Lee said, "was applied this principle to sensory engagement rather than physical engagement. You developed the ability to be second, to respond rather than initiate in the auditory and vestibular domains. You used the other's movement as information, let them commit first, and responded to what they revealed." "Except at the end," Bruce Lee said, "with you I had to become the initiator. Because I was applying the same principle, and between 2 practitioners both operating from the responsive mode, the standoff," Bruce Lee said. "Yes, which you broke with the speech, a third mode, neither initiating physical movement nor responding to physical movement, using a completely different sensory channel to create the conditions for a physical response. That is, I do not have a name for it in my tradition." "I don't have a name for it either," Bruce Lee said. "I'm not sure it needs one. Names are what you give something after you understand it fully. I don't understand this fully yet." He turned the blindfold in his hands. Tonight was a beginning, not a conclusion.
The story did not stay in that room. It never does. Not when 12 people have witnessed something, and 9 of them are martial artists who train with other martial artists and understand, through the specific culture of their world, that some things are worth sharing and some things are worth protecting, and the difficult work is knowing which is which. Most of them chose to protect it. Not all. Fragments emerged. A sentence mentioned in a training context, a thing told to a senior student who had earned the telling,
the specific account of the speech as disruption. That particular detail traveled through certain communities because it was so unexpected, so outside the conventional framework of both combat and of what anyone expected Bruce Lee to do, that it was the kind of thing that changed how people thought about the relationship between sensory systems and martial practice. James Lee never gave a public account. The Hapkido Aster, Sensei Park, gave one interview in 1977, 4 years after Bruce Lee's death, to a small Korean martial arts publication. He spoke carefully and partially. He described the session as the most educationally significant experience of his martial life. He said that he had entered the room as one of 5 experienced practitioners, and that he had left understanding something he could not have predicted before entering. He was asked what that something was. He said that the body knows more than the eyes show it, and that most of us have been teaching the eyes to do all the work while the rest of the body waits, unemployed, for a task that never comes. He was asked if Bruce Lee had beaten them. He was quiet for a moment. Beaten is the wrong word, he said. He demonstrated a principle. The principle required 5 experienced practitioners to demonstrate against, and a dark room, and a blindfold. The principle could not be demonstrated any other way. We were not defeated. We were used, in the most respectful sense, as the instruments through which the principle became visible. The interviewer asked, what was the principle? Park thought for a long moment. That awareness is not a function of sight, he said. That a practitioner who trains only in sighted conditions is training a fraction of what is available to them. That the full human sensory system, when all of it is trained, when none of it is allowed to atrophy behind the dominance of vision, produces a quality of spatial awareness that makes darkness not a catastrophe, but merely a different kind of information. He paused. He was not fighting blind, Park said. He was fighting with his eyes closed. There is a difference. Fighting blind means the loss of information. What he had developed was the ability to receive the same information through different channels. He closed one channel, the dominant one, and found that the others, properly trained, contained everything he needed. In the months after the San Francisco session, Bruce Lee incorporated what he had learned into his training in ways that his closest students noticed but rarely received full explanation for. He began requiring that some training sessions be conducted in low light, not darkness. The full darkness of the training hall session was a specific and extreme test that he had no interest in reproducing routinely, but conditions that placed the visual system under stress, that required the other systems to compensate, that built the layered listening and floor sensitivity and air reading capabilities that had taken 3 weeks of dedicated training to develop sufficiently for the session. He talked to Dan Inosanto about auditory training in a way he had not talked about it before. He described the concept of the acoustic map, the real-time spatial picture built from multiple simultaneous sound sources, and said that every practitioner should be training it whether or not they ever intended to fight in darkness, because the auditory system's spatial resolution, when properly trained, was faster than visual processing at close range. Faster than visual processing. This was the thing that surprised Inosanto most. Bruce Lee explained, visual processing requires the eye to locate, the signal to travel to the visual cortex, the cortex to interpret spatial information from a 2-dimensional image, and the motor system to receive the interpreted spatial data and produce a response. The full chain is fast, but it has length. Auditory spatial processing for sounds within close range travels a shorter chain. The ear locates, the signal travels to the auditory cortex, which is specialized for spatial processing of sounds in a way the visual cortex is not. The chain is faster. At close range, he told Inosanto, in conditions where sound is available, a properly trained practitioner can respond to auditory spatial information faster than they can respond to visual spatial information, not because hearing is faster than sight in general, because the processing chain for close-range auditory location is shorter than the processing chain for close-range visual interpretation. Inosanto would repeat this to his own students for decades. Here is what that San Francisco training hall actually contained on an evening in 1969 when the lights went out and 12 people stood in the dark. It contained a hypothesis being tested. The hypothesis was, sight is a crutch. The other sensory systems contain complete information about the spatial world, available to practitioners who have trained those systems rather than allowing them to atrophy behind the dominance of vision. A practitioner who has trained the full sensory system, auditory, vestibular, tactile, proprioceptive, the sensitivity to air displacement and floor vibration that the body is capable of developing, is not diminished by the removal of vision. They are changed. The information arrives through different channels. The picture is built from different materials, but the picture is complete. Bruce Lee had spent 3 weeks building the evidence to test this hypothesis. 5 black belts and a dark room were the test. The evidence came back positive. Not perfectly positive. 40% reduction in effective capability, the stumble on the Hapkido exchange, the 63-second standoff that required an unconventional solution. Not a flawless demonstration, an honest one. The honest result of a hypothesis tested rigorously rather than performed for an audience. And then 2 hours of conversation. 12 people on a training hall floor, processing what the test had revealed, extending the implications, asking what it meant for practice, for training methodology, for the fundamental question of what a martial artist actually is and what they should be developing. It meant that the body is not primarily a visual system that happens to have other senses attached. It meant that the other senses, the ones most practitioners ignore because sight is faster and easier and more culturally dominant, contain the same information that sight contains, packaged differently, processed differently, available through different training.
It meant that a blind practitioner, properly trained, is not operating at a catastrophic disadvantage. It meant that a practitioner who has trained all the systems simultaneously is not operating at any disadvantage at all. It meant, finally, that the conventional martial artist, the one who trains in well-lit gyms, who always begins and ends a session with full visual information, who has never been asked to build an acoustic map of a space, or read weight through the floor, or feel an approaching body in the resistance of air, that practitioner is, in a very precise and important sense, undertrained. Not in technique, not in strength or speed or power, in awareness. The awareness that is not a function of sight, the awareness that lives in the full sensory system, waiting to be trained, the awareness that, in a dark room in San Francisco in 1969, found 5 black belts in the dark and established position on each of them, and spoke one conversational sentence to break a 63-second standoff with the most sophisticated practitioner in the room. That awareness. Bruce Lee called it, in his notes, simply full sensing. He spent the rest of his life working on it. He said it was never finished. The old man in Guangzhou would have understood why. Only 12 people were in that room. The footage was never released, because there was no footage, only darkness, and in the darkness, a man with a blindfold, showing 5 black belts, that what they couldn't see was not the absence of information, it was the beginning of a different kind of knowing. Subscribe, because the most important training sessions in history never had cameras. They only had people willing to turn out the lights and find out what was actually there.